Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, I'm joined by my friend Zack Chapple. Zachary is the founder of Zephyr Cloud and also the CEO, and is one of the inventors of Module Federation, a way of building applications in a decentralized way for very large teams. Now, if you hear terms like Module Federation and Micro-Frontends, some of you might have skepticism arise. Some of you may go, I don't care about Module Federation. I don't believe in micro-frontends. And indeed, I was also, and to some degree still am, maybe one of the skeptics. That's exactly why we have this discussion. Zack, in this episode, really patiently explains the whole point behind micro-frontend architecture, and then as an extension of that module federated architecture, and talks about when's a good time for it, when's not a good time for it, and all of the nuance in between. We also go into detail about Zachary's company, Zephyr Cloud, a company that makes module federation and micro-frontends a first-class citizen, and in many ways revolutionizes developer workflows, where you don't have to develop against local host anymore, but through a build plugin, the moment you hit save or you press Command S on macOS, instead of hot module reload locally, it instantly deploys the micro frontend you're working on, or the front end you're working on, to Cloudflare, I believe. And then your site is just instantly available as a preview. So instead of like save and hot module reload and then git commit and then git push, and then open a pull request and then get a deploy preview, the moment you hit save, you get a deploy preview. Absolutely bananas. And in this episode, you will hear my mind blown multiple times, because I was pleasantly surprised at the power of Module Federation, micro-frontends, and the combination with Zephyr Cloud. So all of that awaits you in this episode. If you've heard the terms Module Federation, micro-frontend, and don't fully understand what they mean, or if you've maybe heard it and you do understand and you don't like them, then this episode is definitely for you. Now, I'd like to make all of this available to you at no cost. It is all available to you at no cost, and the way we can do that is because someone else bears the cost, and this is sponsors. So if we take a moment to thank the sponsors of the podcast, we then continue. The Contagious Code Podcast is sponsored by Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a website that helps engineers level up their coding skills by teaching the way I teach, by implementing things like Git and Redis and Docker from scratch in a programming language you know and love. They give you code challenges to build the mechanisms of them in a language you understand to level up your coding game, and at the same time you understand how these things work. It's really cool. So they have a paid tier, and if you want to take part in the paid tier, you get 40% off if you use our link. That's tej.as/codecrafters. It's also in the show notes. The Contagious Code Podcast is also partnered with Stately.ai. Stately is the way to do state machines. You visualize them in their visualizer, and then you can export them to JSON and just fill in the business logic, and your application follows. If you'd like to give them a try, go to stately.ai. Finally, we're partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a really great multidisciplinary tech conference that happens twice a year in Wisconsin and in Texas, and we give away free tickets all the time. If you'd like to win one, share this episode on social media. The first one to share it, and mention me and that you want the ticket, will get it, guaranteed. So if you want to do that, share this episode on social media and say, I want to win a ticket to that conference, and we'll get you that. Thanks for sticking around. Now for my discussion with Zack Chapple. Zachary Chapple, welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast.
Thank you. No, it's fantastic, and I just go by Zach if that's easier, because Zachary's only when I'm in trouble.
That's good. Yeah, it's I think I saw Zachary on LinkedIn or something.
Yeah.
To keep it profesh. Fantastic. I'm excited to dive into a number of topics on this episode, all the way from native desktop applications with Tauri, through Module Federation, through Zephyr Cloud, and really how all of those tie together. Something we do consistently on the podcast is we draw lines from point A to point B to point C. It's almost a good, reasonable metaphor that a lot of the things in the tech space are nodes in some type of graphs, but the edges aren't very clear. And so hopefully we can do that together in our time today.
Yep.
Before we dive into all of that, could we do a little bit of an introduction to our listeners of you and what you've been up to and your background?
Yeah, so my name's Zack Chapple. I'm the CEO of Zephyr Cloud. Started that back in August with a friend of mine, Dmitry Shikosov. Before that was the chief revenue officer of a staff augmentation consulting firm called Valor Software. And before that, I had a whole number of jobs doing either development or architecture, and a lot of time in the code myself, and now a little bit less in the code, but starting to get back into it now that we have Zephyr.
Fantastic. Let's maybe start with Zephyr Cloud, just because you're the CEO of it. Could you start by giving us a little bit of an overview of it is, of what it is and its mission, and maybe the motivation for where does it come from? Again, if we're drawing lines, right, this would have had to have start as an idea from somewhere. I need to start this to solve a problem. So let's start at the beginning.
Right. Well, it's funny because it connects to not only my career path, but also Module Federation and Towery at the same time. So,
Whoa.
like, it's kind of an interesting journey. So, my background personally is working in large enterprises, right? If you work in a lot of large enterprises, you have a lot of the same problems. How do we get distributed systems to go out? How do we get things to be reliable and observable? And a lot of times we end up building these giant monolithic spas, and we use things like npm to handle versioning, right? And that's just how people do things. And you see people doing similar things in Towery apps, right? Like, I have modules, I've versioned those modules, and that was just how we did things. When I joined Valor Software, one of our customers, and this is public information, it's okay to share, was SAP, and they wanted us to add module federation support to Angular. So Dimitri added module federation support to Angular, and they wanted that because they wanted to be able to version parts of a new application that they were building, right? And in the course of doing that, we ended up meeting and connecting with Zack Jackson, who's the guy who actually created Module Federation. We started doing a bunch of work with him, and it was through the conversations that he brought to us that we saw the reality of when large enterprises use Module Federation and the huge amount of configuration that they have to do, and boilerplate, and every developer loves boilerplate, that they have there. And it was, for a website that may have 50 micro front ends, it was several hundred lines of configuration. And Zach at the time, the other Zach, so Zach, if I say Zach, I'm not talking about myself in the third person. So Zach Jackson had an idea and had a precursor platform called Medusa. And Medusa was kind of like the first iteration of us adding observability and orchestration to micro-frontends. And we worked on that for 16 months. Ended up getting an enterprise customer on accident, which was really quite fun. Felt like we were getting attacked because we went from no traffic in Asia to 1.6 million hits a day in APAC, and we're like, what is going on? And turned out somebody just turned it down to production without telling us. We're like, well, thank you. But it was when we tried to take it to other customers that we realized, like, hey, something's missing, because they were all saying, hey, we need to be able to develop faster, we need to be able to deploy faster, and Medusa is only taking care of just the after it's on the cloud side. So then in August we started Zephyr, so with the bigger vision of, like, how do we accelerate the developer, how do we accelerate the pipeline to actual production, and then how do we make production itself much more reliable for micro front ends. And that was our initial way of starting it.
Okay, so Zephyr Cloud is, let me say it back to you so I understand. Zephyr Cloud is the cloud, the deployment platform for micro frontends in a module federation based architecture. It removes a lot of the boilerplate that these large enterprise customers or large enterprises had to face, and sort of automates some of that so that developers in these enterprises can focus on actually shipping value. How close or far is that from the offer?
That's really close with what we started with. So, like, when we started, we built it specifically for module federation for distributed applications, and it still solves that problem very, very well, right? But the funny thing about solving that problem is every application is a micro front end by itself. It's only when you start to combine it. Well, yeah, I know, right? It'll blow your mind a little bit. So, like, every application could be one of the remotes in a distributed large monolith, right? So you could have a spa that's being loaded as one of your remotes. You could have, an entire application or a single page or just a header, right? And once we realized that, we shifted how we talk about Zephyr a little bit to not just be about module federation and micro frontends, but just front ends in general. But with the specialty and the focus on really handling those distributed micro frontends really well. So they're first class, but not only class.
Awesome. I want to take a moment and dive into some of the more fundamental particles, so to speak, of our discussion. For the listeners who aren't yet initiated, you mentioned SPA. And again, for those who really aren't initiated, SPA is a single page application, which is basically a blank page that then loads JavaScript on the client and becomes interactive exclusively on the client. But assuming people are clear on the definition of SPA, let's maybe define module federation, micro frontends, as we've talked about. And then I think this will all make the dots connect a little bit better about how Zephyr Cloud supports that as a first-class citizen and some of its more extended capabilities. So can we talk a little bit about module federation and micro frontends? And by that, I mean specifically, let's maybe define, first of all, what it is, and second of all, where it comes from and when it's a good idea to use. And I want to preface this by saying there are probably skeptics listening. I'm very familiar with developers who have strong opinions about things, and some people on X will say things like, module federation just solves really an organizational problem, not a code problem. And so I'd love, factoring in all of those points, I'd love it if we can establish a working definition of those two terms.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's the exact same battle that people have on the back end, right? Should you have a Rails monolith, or should you have a bunch of micros? Oh, I triggered a bunch of people about Rails right now. Should you have a Rails monolith, or should you have, JavaScript or Java-based microservices, right? And that actually really aligns well with how we, at least to our investors and to the uninitiated, describe micro frontends and module federation, right? If you've been around development, even if you're not a developer, you've heard people talk about microservices, right? The purpose of microservices is to be able to decompose and deploy things independently and be able to scale independently and all of that, right? And micro front ends are the same thing for obviously the front end. And if you think about it, when microservices first came out, it was great because everyone could build and deploy anything they wanted. It was awesome for about a day. And then people were like, this is horrible. Everyone's doing whatever they want. There's no control. There's no understanding of what they're importing, what they're exporting, how they're sharing things. So then Docker became a thing, right? And when Docker became a thing, it was great. Everyone's like, okay, now I know what I'm consuming. Now I know what my baseline is. And then that became a problem, and then Kubernetes became a thing, right? The front end is going through a very similar evolution. We've had these very long-standing, giant monolithic front ends that we began to decompose into micro front ends, which are analogous to microservices, and we've done that several different ways, right? We've done it with Require.js, we've done it with true micro front ends. We've done it with React lazy routes, like all of that kind of stuff. And where module federation comes in is it's basically Docker for the front end, is what I like to tell people. And if you look at the API for module federation, it is very similar, right? What do I consume? What do I expose? How do I initialize? All of that kind of stuff is there, right? And that served us very well for 3.5 years. But as organizations started to scale, they needed more of that kind of like Kubernetes kind of experience. And that's where Medusa and now Zephyr comes in, because it provides that observability, orchestration, deployment, developer experience layer on top of these front ends that people come to expect in a distributed system. And if you want, we could talk about the scale at which that becomes appropriate, and we might get a little dogmatic about that, but I think that would be a fun rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, and indeed, let's go down that. But again, just to make sure I understand, and the listeners, I'm a proxy for the listeners, right? Just to make
Yeah.
sure that we understand. I think it's clear how. So let's just talk a little bit. Let's dive deeper into micro-frontend specifically, because you said something really profound earlier that had me like raising an eyebrow. You said every Spark would be a micro-frontend based on the export. So let's talk a little bit about micro-frontends, and specifically the main question at the top of my mind, and I anticipate on the top of the listeners' minds, is what is the boundary between a micro front, what is the separation point from a front end to have a micro front end? Does that make sense? For example, if I've got a spa and I've got a sidebar and I've got, I don't know, like a product detail thing on the right hand side, which of them should be micro front ends? Should all of them be micro front ends? Am I thinking about this correctly? That if we take the analogy from monolith to microservice to monolithic front end to micro front end, then from a monolith you'd break out like certain services that are maybe key services. Like you'd want your authentication service to be a separate service so that it doesn't crash when the rest of your app crashes, and it can be tested in isolation and so on and so forth. So if we take that analogy and apply it to front ends, then the boundary still doesn't become very clear to me. For example, if we consider, let's say, the Amazon.com homepage, should the personalized list of products, hey, here's some products for you, should that then be maybe considered to be a micro front end because it's maybe critical, right? It's also personalized, so it maybe will take some more time to load. It may be managed by an entirely different team. I guess I hope the question is becoming clear, which is like, what's the boundary of breaking apart a monolithic front end into one or more micro front ends?
That's an interesting one. So it becomes a question on what is your priority? And one way that we've described it is breaking out things that are low risk, that don't change very often. If the header is fairly static, right? Or the footer is a good example, right? If you want to break out the footer because it's something you don't touch very often, you don't need to build it very often, you don't care about it, you could just break that out as a micro front end and just let it live on its own, right? That's one strategy, and people do that with microservices too. This is one of those things that you set and forget. Then it doesn't matter. What I've seen more often though is it's more of a product or a business decision on what needs to iterate fast and independent. So you think about Amazon.com, right? The related items, the product listing page, the product detail page, those are frequently things that have to iterate fast. And those are some of the first things that you typically decouple from the monolith so they can iterate fast, right? There's a lot of business value that comes along with that. The other part, and actually I was watching a discussion happen in our investors' internal social network. They were talking about launch darkly and feature flags and stuff like that. And they were talking about feature flags as a way to be able to roll forward and roll backwards, right? If something goes wrong, we need to be able to roll forward, roll backwards. And module federation and micro front ends allow you to do that without adding a bunch of noise of feature flags in your code base, right? And there's a whole different debate we can get about whether or not people should use feature flags, but that's one way that I like to look at it.
Fantastic. So the boundary could be, okay, it's the things that you mentioned, maybe take something that's not so critical, factor it out, and now you've got a multi-front-end setup. I love this use case of feature flags because we had a big experimentation culture at Spotify where you can segment users based on a variety of metrics, and then to a specific cohort serve a certain feature and so on. You could do that based on feature flags, but I can see how based on certain metrics you could say serve this version of the related products or that version, and so you don't have feature flags. You just serve a different module.
Well, and that ties into Zephyr too, because like one of the things that we've been trying to talk about as we look at Zephyr is like, imagine the culture. So if you know feature flags, that's fantastic, and you love that experimentation. One of the things that's really interesting is that imagine being able to, instead of having to add a feature flag to your code, you just write the new version, you open a PR, it builds, deploys to the cloud. The feature flagging system or Zephyr or whatever you're using can then balance users to it. And then if it ends up being a positive test, it adds a label on it. It gets merged. That's now a new version. You're not cleaning up feature flags 6 months in the future. You're not, because we all know that once you add feature flags to your code base, they will get old. People will stop maintaining them. And a company I was helping with, they have like 1,837 feature flags, and I think it was 1,100 of them are at 100% ramp, and I think it was like 800 of them are at 0% ramp, and out of the 1,800, only 83 are actively somewhere in between 0 and 100.
Wow. Can we talk about that term you used, ramp? What does that mean?
Oh, so like as you start to experiment and expose feature flags, if you go from 0% to 5%, 25, you start
Right.
ramping up how many users are using it.
Right.
So like if you think about that, like if you have that many flags that are at 100%, and they've been at 100% for more than a couple days or more than a couple weeks, that it's probably a feature flag you can get rid of. But nobody's got time for that. I got other product features to ship. I got other things to do. It's not on my backlog, so they get left there, right?
Wow.
And that's the danger of what I see in terms of using feature flags, because it becomes not a priority to clean them up. And then until they get deleted in production as a flag, and then everything goes down, and you have to go clean up your flags. So if that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate. So we talked about micro front ends, and we drew some parallels with microservices. That's great. I think we've established a real good basis of discussion and working understanding between us and the listeners. Let's talk about module federation. And I'll tell you the way I've heard it. Again, just being a proxy to the listeners, and then we can clarify any misunderstandings there. A micro front end is a module. It's usually a JavaScript module that, like, React lazy can be lazy imported and used. So the term module is clear that it's just a JavaScript file that exports something. Let's talk about this federation piece. Is it that you split out your micro frontends into modules, you host them on some CDN or something, and you dynamically import them? That's federated. That's a federated graph, right? We just want to establish a working term for this discussion so that people aren't confused.
So they could be distributed on a CDN, but they could also be coming from the file system too, which is interesting. So we've seen organizations, because module federation does not necessarily care where the string comes from, right? And that's the important thing. It's like all module federation is telling you, like, okay, I need to load this string. Here's the location of this string. And then once I get this string, here's how I initialize it, and here's how I do something with it, right? So and now with 2.0, there's more lifecycle hooks, but that's the important part to understand, is once you think about it as, okay, I'm just getting a string from somewhere, right? Then you could say, okay, that may be from an S3 bucket, that may be from an API response, that may be from a CDN, right? And once you think of it that way, it makes it a lot easier. So the distributed nature of module federation and the versioning becomes really interesting once you have that frame of mind.
Okay, but I think just in terms of a definition, this is very clear, and I can also see. I think we all can hear and see how module federation and micro frontends sort of go hand in hand here, because when you break apart a monolithic front-end app into a variety of modules, then you federate them and import them. I think this is interesting because it's almost like. Absolutely. Yes, this is for you.
Because you just reminded me. So remember that face you made earlier when I talked about like anything could be a micro front end. And it's very similar to anything could be a microservice, right? You could have a microservice that is in essence kind of a monolith still, right? You haven't decoupled it. You haven't made it single responsibility. Like, it's still this giant thing. And the way you were just describing it really made it kind of analogous to me. Is like, if you think about your entire application, like Amazon.com, right? if you were to try and migrate that to Module Federation, which I think it might already be on Module Federation, the first thing you would do is you would create a shell, and then you would put the entirety of Amazon.com as one piece, right? That is your micro front end, right? And that sounds like horrible, but it is, it's your first micro front end. It could be the entirety of it, right? And then you could start to, yak shave. You could start to shave off like the header and the footer and the things that you want to start to decompose. But the same thing's true for microservices, right? So like you could start with, this giant API that you then, as you start to hit scaling problems, as you start to hit, churn, you could start to shave off pieces into microservices, like smaller microservices. The front end's the same way, right? So you also see this a lot in enterprises too, where they have this old functionality that they need to put in, so they iframe it, right? With Module Federation,
it's like the OG micro front ends.
Oh gosh, I saw someone that had 30 copies of an iframe on a page. Like, it's great.
Wow.
Because it was doing the tile preview images, and you had entire Dojo applications loading on every single image. Like, it's great. But what's really interesting about that is, especially with the new version of Module Federation that you can use to detect and serve frameworks, you don't have to leverage iframes, at least internally, the way you did before. You're able to manage those dependencies a little bit more cleanly because there's an architecture that's able to do that for you, and that's Module Federation.
You mentioned the new version of Module Federation. That makes it sound like an NPM package or a piece of software as opposed to a technique. Is it? What does version mean here?
So Module Federation 2.0, right? So like when Module Federation was first started, Zack put it as part of Webpack, right? So it was part of Webpack 5 beta, and it was just part of Webpack, which is also, it was opt-in, so that's part of what got us so much adoption for Module Federation, right? There's 472,000 sites that use Module Federation, which is a lot, and because it's in Webpack though, the ability to iterate and change things is more restricted, right? Webpack is a very infamous framework for not necessarily moving very fast, but also because they are incredibly stable, right? They power so much of the web. And when we started writing tests, like there's stuff that goes all the way back to Webpack 1 that still has, compatibility, which is really saying a lot, right? Because they're on Webpack 5 now. So there's some really interesting stuff there. So that being said, like it made it really hard to build new things into Module Federation. And so Zack, together with the ByteDance team, started to extract what they actually a lot of what Zack Jackson and what ByteDance had been doing internally into like a version 1.5 of Module Federation. So if you saw a lot of tweets around, version 1.5. And now that's evolving.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but that's version 1.5 of the Webpack plugin?
No, so it was extracted and made its own NPM package called Module Federation Enhanced.
Oh.
So yes. And so Module Federation Enhanced is its own thing that has 1.5. And what's interesting is RSPack, the default version, is actually the new version. Mm-hmm. So you could use the legacy, air quotes. I gotta get my fingers close stuff. The legacy version of, I look like Dr. Evil. The legacy version of Module Federation, which is the 1.0 stuff, is still an RSPack, but the default is the new version. And that's where a lot of like the enhanced capabilities come in around like the lifecycle hooks and stuff like that. Their enhanced package exists on NPM to be able to monkey patch those features in for the Webpack users.
Fantastic. And this is going to make me sound extremely ignorant and noobish, but I literally just now understood that it's an NPM package because I keep hearing about it like a technique.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll drop the link. Is there a chat in here too?
There is, but nobody's going to see it. So we'll add a link to the show notes about that. Yeah. Because I think this is, and that's, I guess it's sort of It's like creating an npm package named like rag or data fetching. It's like you have an npm package named after a technique, and you go like, okay, but which one are we talking about here?
Right.
Yeah, but that's cool. That makes sense. Okay, is Module Federation now still paired with Webpack? Almost. You mentioned
So
RSPack, so not. Can I use Module Federation with Vite?
yes.
Oh, cool.
So and there's some fun things with that. So first, like that's the I'll touch on the RSPack part first. The interesting thing about RSPack, right, is almost everything that you could do in Webpack, you could do with RSPack natively, right?
What is
Because,
the difference here between Webpack and RSPack? Like, and I'm
uh,
asking because the vast majority of our listeners will use ESBuild or Vite or something from the
right.
UnJS ecosystem. So yeah, if we could maybe talk about RSPack
So
a bit.
the reason they probably do is because Webpack was so slow.
Yes.
The okay, so a lot of large organizations have built years and years worth of stuff on top of Webpack. They have custom plugins, they have entire ecosystems, they have, chunk loading and all this stuff that they've built on top of Webpack, right? And when you try to move to other things, you have different problems, right? I was working with an organization, they tried to move from Webpack to ESBuild, and they didn't understand that there was now going to be thousands of chunks, and it destroyed LCP, right? So, less contentful paint or largest contentful paint. And it was
Why
becoming
was there? Sorry to interrupt you, but moving from Webpack to Vite, why was there going to be thousands of
they
chunks? Or
they
not
didn't
Vite, sorry, ESBuild.
because they didn't manage the how the build output was being created, right? And they were used to like how Webpack did it, where it just put out 3 to 5 chunks, and those 3 to 5 chunks became 1,000 chunks with ESBuild, right? That's just how it was configured, and you'll see that the same thing was happening in the Angular community too. That some people were complaining about the ESBuild output from in Angular in the new version 16, 17, I believe 18. When they switched to ESBuild, they couldn't because of the quantity of chunks that would be output. Where that ties into RSPack, the ByteDance team was struggling with build times and build performance and how much it was costing them. And they said, okay, we want to do something faster. So they tried to use rollup. And like, rollup's too slow. Let's try to rewrite rollup in Rust. And they called it rolldown. And super developers are great at naming things, and it was great. But then they run into some issues that wasn't good enough, and it would take too much to convert everything that they had in Webpack. So then they started to rewrite Webpack in Rust, and that whole rewrite it in Rust movement type stuff, right? And they spent 6 months working on rewriting Webpack to Rust. And that's when I was able to jump in and help them to open source it, and got them connected with the Netlify folks and the NX folks, and we did some really cool stuff in that space. But now that it's out, you have almost, I don't know what percentage is that, but every organization I've touched or talked to, everything was already done in terms of API compatibility. And if it wasn't, there was a path on how to switch. And one organization I was just recently helping, they had a 6.7 times improvement to their build times. And in terms of local developer productivity, it saves them $32 million a year.
Wow.
And it took about 3 days to migrate.
Incredible.
And that's only because there was a couple bugs around mini CSS extract, and we had to wait for ByteDance to fix it. And then they fixed it. And it was just like, okay, great. Well, 3 days of effort. Here's $32 million back. What would you like to do now? That's the really interesting thing, is like you have this entire huge ecosystem of things that have been built around Webpack, and you could still use them. But where it comes to Module Federation, because Module Federation was part of Webpack, when RSPack added the hooks needed, it just worked, right? There's a
That's so
hashtag
cool.
around it. It just works, right? Now, what's interesting is Evan Yu has been working on the next version of Vite, and the next version of Vite is going to be leveraging roll down, right? Which is, public. It's on the, GitHub and all that stuff. If you go and look at their roadmap, you will see that module federation is on that roadmap. And that is to add native module federation support to roll down itself. What's interesting is the part of that team that's working on that came from ByteDance and built the RSPack side of it. So they are intimately familiar with module federation, intimately familiar with Rust, and they will be able to do it, properly, very well. But also the last couple of days, you've also been probably seen Zack tweeting about ESBuild support. So now that there's import map support and ESBuild support, you can imagine that there's a lot that we can do now across all the different bundlers with module federation.
Fantastic. I can't wait to see how that develops. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into module federation and micro-frontends. And I think all of this will tell a finer story as we transition to Zephyr Cloud in a few minutes, because what I'm trying to get at is the inherent complexity with micro-frontends and module federation. And if I understand correctly, Zephyr Cloud takes away a lot of that in service of developer workflows. So if I think about a bare bones sort of poor man's module federation / micro-frontend architecture, it's with iframes. We talked about iframes. So we talked about Amazon.com, and maybe this recommended products thing could become a federated module, aka a micro front end that is dynamically loaded and placed and rendered. So doing that, achieving bare bones micro front end architecture would require an iframe with a separate JavaScript bundle that identifies a root node and attaches to it. Here, this is obviously very OG, and I can already in my mind picture a number of issues with it.
And there's people screaming on the podcast as they listen to it, no, don't use iframes.
Yeah, so let's talk about the issues with that and how to ameliorate them with module federation. I can already think of the issues of data passing, for example. You can't just use the beautiful scope and closure that we're familiar with JavaScript. You'd have to find some way to serialize things and pass messages between frames. You can't serialize functions. There's going to be a pain. Right, that's probably one thing.
And it becomes a disaster real quick.
Right, and then there's also security concerns. So, okay, let's talk about the issues with this OG, yuck in air quotes, horrible version of module federation and micro frontends, and then let's step up from there.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it federation, but I would call it micro frontends. Yeah, so there's tons of obvious problems with that, right? Especially the moment you say iframes, you start thinking styles, right? Styles is a huge issue when you're using iframes, trying to get things to be consistent. You have the end user, the RUM impacting, so the real user metrics impacting implications of that too, because you're loading an entire site as well, right? So its own copies of jQuery, its own copies of Dojo or React or Angular, whatever it is. I know. I've been seeing Dojo way too much lately. So that's the reality, right? And it's every single time you have an iframe, right? So if you have something that has 5 or 6 iframes, you have 5 or 6 copies of that framework on your site.
And you could interchangeably use the term 5 or 6 micro frontends as 5 or 6 iframes in this example. So it doesn't scale.
Exactly. It doesn't scale, and it's less of an issue in countries like the United States where you have fiber and you have 5G and all this other stuff. But you go anywhere else in the world, or even to somewhere that has lower signal, then your site becomes unusable. And there's also the responsiveness and all that kind of stuff that's really hard, because when you have something as an iframe, when you get that scroll inside of a scroll, the moment you try to use something on your phone, you're like, yuck, you die inside.
Yeah. Okay. That all of that sucks, and it gives me major nightmares. And I appreciate taking the time to dive into that. So now let's talk about module federation as a step up. So if I was to implement, again, without any domain knowledge, as a complete noob, I go with my gut, and implement this like iframe thing. But very quickly I run into those problems. Oh my gosh, it's so slow, it's unusable. The styles are off. I get this error from React because now I have two Reacts on the same page somehow, maybe not, because it's an iframe. I hate passing messages. I encounter all these issues as a new developer, and I'm like, there has to be a step up. And then I go towards, what if I could, instead of iframes, lazy import JavaScript. So dynamically import. So I will await, I will import a JavaScript bundle that maybe attaches to a DOM node, and therefore all the styles are available, and then I dynamically build like virtual DOM and attach it, sort of like React style. What are some issues with that? And is that closer toward micro-frontend architecture as we know it today?
I think that's closer, right? That's where you start getting into like the React lazy and the lazy loaded routes, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm actually more familiar with Angular than I am React. But the whole concept of lazy loaded routes is in both frameworks,
Yeah.
so that's they're analogous that way. The interesting thing with that is it becomes harder to manage across versions, which is something that we could touch on, but then also like the what you're actually consuming and exposing with those in those. You load the entirety of whatever that lazy loaded thing is, right? And then that's now bootstrapped and available and all that, right? So there's that is like the next stage of evolution, right? Yes, you have less bytes that come down on the initial wire. Yes, you can lazy load it. It's going to make your app more performant. But you still have a little bit less control over what's actually being consumed and how it's being consumed and the life cycle in which it's being consumed, right? Because yeah, maybe you have it wrapped in a suspense boundary, but that's all you have. There's no initialization beyond that. There's no context that you're able to share very easily beyond that. You're requiring it to be on the hooks that are on the components themselves, which becomes fun to manage.
Yes. Okay. Great. And so I feel this pain. I understand the issues with this approach. Now it's time for micro frontends the way they are today, the way they're used by these enterprises in large scale and so on. How do we get from this sort of middle tier with lazy loading stuff to where we are today?
ChatGPT. No, so no, in all seriousness, like you could ask ChatGPT, like how do I add module federation to my application, and it'll tell you how to do it in Webpack. But
No, I mean more architecturally. Like going from an iframe, we recognize those constraints, and so we switch. We do some lazy loaded thing, but we also recognize the constraints there. So just not practically, like not like here's give me a step by step, but like in philosophy, right? How do we evolve this to today's micro front end?
Well, now once you start to realize that you don't have to bring the world with you when you expose something or when you consume something, you can have let's say you have a design system is a good example in this case, right? And your design system could be one of your federated remotes, and you could say I'm going to consume button and text box and all these other things from the design system, and then as the application starts, it will be able to consume that properly through module federation. There's a lot of really good benefits that come along with it. The same thing's true for like product listing, if we want to go back to the Amazon example, right? Rather than loading the entirety of product listing, I could say I need the product listing preview. I could say I need just this one aspect of it. And the product listing remote can say, okay, here are the options and things that I expose. Here's how I expose them. And here's the location at which I expose them. And it makes that a lot easier to manage.
What is a remote here? That term may not be familiar to listeners.
So the remote is so module federation is a concept of, sorry, I'm bouncing around, concept of hosts and remotes, and anything could be a remote and anything could be a host, which is they're just terms that are used, which is kind of confusing. But in this case, the remote is the JavaScript or the string of the JavaScript that you're trying to fetch to load that code, right? So that is the remote itself.
And the host is the domain
No,
where the
no. So the host is the host application, the host Webpack instance. So like
got you.
not host name. So the
Yeah.
Webpack host.
Okay. Fantastic.
But
So
you could, but
with Mhm.
I was gonna say because the where that comes into play is that a a a micro front end like the product listing page could be
Mhm.
the host and it consumes a remote of the design system, right? But that product listing page can be a remote for your main application that is the host. So you have a shell that's the host, and then that loads product listing page, and then that has its own remotes that it's able to bring in. So you can onion yourself pretty
Yeah.
easily.
Fantastic. Or in Reacty terms, you can have a composition model like components, where a host can compose over
Yep.
multiple remotes together. Awesome. Thank you for patiently answering questions on behalf of myself and listeners. I want to continue pulling on this thread because okay, cool. We can now step up from this lazy loading approach that lazy loads everything, and get some more fine-grained control with module federation. I want to talk about how we get those. So does a remote, as you mentioned, will specify, here's what you can get from me, here's how, and I'm assuming this is all part of the module federation specification.
Yep.
How is that better? So if we come back to, not how is that better, I understand how that's better, but what fine-grained control can we get? For example, I assume there's heuristics for don't give me everything. Like you said, give me just a preview. Give me I'm completely lost here. So what would the remote offer you or offer a host that helps make the experience of the user more fluid, performant, and better?
Well, it has. I mean, I think one part is like the ability to be able to decide when you initialize something, right? I think that makes it a little bit better. The ability to um kind of control how you resolve it, like so, like the logic around and I hate this is going to be a fun one to try and explain the fetching of the code, the initializing of the code. Module federation gives you mechanisms around that, but they haven't always been clean, right? So like the implementation that's most used right now on the Webpack documentation is promise, do promise, and then you have this giant obnoxious template string that is all of your code, or including fetching of code and initializing things and a bunch of stuff like that. Zack started to refactor that to using delegate modules, which I don't completely understand, but there's people who do.
Yeah.
And then but now with 2.0, we're actually past delegate modules now and using the lifecycle hooks of Federation 2. So that's a really long-winded answer I don't feel answered the question because I lost
It's,
one.
it's perfect. I think if I can summarize that, it's just that module federation, both 2.0 and previous versions, give you more control about how you load federated modules, aka micro frontends, and also when you load them and when you execute them, and so on and so forth. So
Yep.
they give you guardrails effectively to curate the experience you want your users to have. Great.
Exactly.
I asked Artem. So we had a previous episode with Artem Zakharchenko from Epic Web, who is just obsessed with testing and teaching people about tests and when to write tests and so on.
Yeah.
And we had a really great discussion where, I asked him, when's the best time to write tests? Do you go like full TDD and just write your test suite first and then implement against it? Do you create like some rough prototype and then when you're sort of confident it works, then quickly write some tests and then continue to build on it to make sure nothing breaks? Or do you finish the implementation and then test just to like seal its fate, so to speak, so it can't break in the future, right? I asked him this, and obviously his answer was it depends. There's no single right answer. But then I was like, okay, but which one would you bias towards? And his answer was the middle one. Like build a prototype, make sure it's sort of working for you. The feedback loop is satisfactory, and then seal it with tests and then continue. I wanted to ask a question in the similar spirit about micro frontends. Because I don't know. I think a lot of listeners don't know is if we're building an application, say a new application, and we anticipate, moderate scale. So not like billions of concurrent users instantly, but like something like Riverside or Linear. Oh, maybe Linear is a bad example.
Can I interrupt on that one?
Sure.
I would say the scale that we care about more on the module federations and the micro-frontend side is not the scale of the users, but the scale of the team.
Okay.
Right? Because if you're one developer working on an application, and you could have one developer, especially with like, V0 and all that stuff that exists now, right, from Vercel, right? If you could be one developer and scale to $1 billion platform, if you believe all the hype, right? The interesting side of that is you could build a giant application by yourself. The moment you start to work with other people, that's when you stop putting your code in Dropbox. Or that's why we have Git now, right? Because we need to be able to do commits. We need to be able to manage things professionally. The same thing is true with module federation, but I'll let you go back to it. I just wanted to like segue that and be like, it's not the scale of the users, but it's the scale of the team, I would say.
Right. That's super helpful. Yeah. So what I understand is if I'm an indie developer, if I'm like Levels.io, Peter Levels, I found out that was his name, then I just don't need module federation because it's just me and I'm comfortable working the way I work. I could maybe have some elaborate build process that gives me a bundle that I just like SCP. So I'll copy this over FTP or something to my bare metal machine and serve it, and it's good. Is that accurate so far?
Unless you want to start A/B testing stuff easily, then yes, that's reasonably accurate.
Awesome, great. And so then I let's say I turn into a company and I grow and I've got now 100 people and it's it's a billion concurrent users, but the users don't matter, or at least the users always matter. The number of users doesn't matter in this case, but it's a giant team, sort of like eBay, and we're working on a check. Like, so when I was at Spotify, we had like one team specifically for the checkout experience to like buy premium. At this scale, I do see the value of module federation. So I guess I answered my own question, or you answered it. The question is like, at what point do you add module federation and consider micro-frontend architecture? But it seems like the point is your team is just huge.
I wouldn't say huge, but yeah, the moment you have a team that is working on different things, that's the point, right? Because once you have a team that's working on different things and they need to be able to build and deploy independently, then that's when you need it, right? Because that could be a team of 5 or 10 people, right? And we've had some organizations that are at 5 or 10 people that want to use module federation, that want to use Zephyr because they want the versioning and the feature flagging and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need a giant team to be able to do it, but it's more of a I want my team to be able to work independently problem.
Interesting. Yeah. So how fragmented is your team? Because your team of 5 or 10, each member on the team could be working on an entirely different portion of the application. Yeah, totally. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was gonna say fragmented versus distributed too, right? Because you could have a distributed team that's not fragmented, right?
That's true. How does one enforce identical versions between host and remote applications? I love that I can use, while you think about that, I love that I can just use these terms now like I'm an expert host and remote. You did this. I didn't even know that these terms, but now you've explained them so well that I'm like, cool.
So you can enforce it, right? But to an extent by saying like, here's what I load, and if someone tries to load something different, you force them to load. You could force them to load the version that you want them to, right? So you could say, okay, great. If someone's trying to pull in React, here's the version of React you absolutely have to use, right? So there is some level of enforcement there. But at the same time, and people will get mad about this, you don't have to. The reality of micro frontends and the reality of large enterprises is that you will have portions of your application that will be stuck on older versions, right? An acquisition, somebody that hasn't moved yet, whatever it is, right? And the fun part about things like Module Federation and especially Module Federation 2 is that you can say, okay, great, you can use this version or this version, right? If you're using this framework, you can use this version, right? So like there's the ability to use them together and not necessarily enforce that if you don't have to.
Great. But you could, if you have, for example, behind a feature flag, you want to load version 2 of this micro frontend or version 1 of that micro frontend. I say feature flag, excuse me, not feature flag, but deployment, module federation architecture. Based on some criteria, you want to load module A or module B, you can somehow using probably Zephyr Cloud. Okay, cool.
Well, using Module Federation, you can do that with Module Federation itself, right? So like, especially with Module Federation 2. So we have examples in the Module Federation core and Module Federation examples that are using React 16, 17, and 18 together. We did that for a large consumer application that recently had an acquisition that didn't go through. So they needed React 16, 17, and 18 to work together. And they needed Module Federation, and they needed SSR, and all these other things. So we had to write a wrapper that would show people how to load multiple versions of React, which we didn't think was a common use case until we told people we had it, and like, oh my God, you're saving me tons of time. Thank you for not forcing me to upgrade first. And I think that's a really interesting use case.
That's incredible. Okay, I think we have like a deep enough understanding now of micro frontends, of module federation. This is so great. Thank you, really, for like explaining this in basic terms and then going as deep as we want. So now that we understand these things, let's talk about Zephyr Cloud. It sounds like Zephyr Cloud is essentially module federation as a service. Was it the case that before founding Zephyr Cloud, the company, the product, you and your team probably did a ton of consulting for enterprises using Module Federation, and it started as consulting, and then you're like, oh, they have all these problems, let's just productize it. Is that how it started?
Yeah, it was a lot of the same problems. Like we kept getting in these large enterprises that were, and even ourselves as we were consulting on it. Like it's a little bit like Backstage. Or not Backstage. Who is it? It's like ClickUp, and I think it starts with a B. You know what I'm talking about?
I do not.
Basecamp.
DHH's company.
Yeah, so Basecamp. We're not going to use Rails. The Basecamp example is a really, really similar, right? They kept experiencing the pain themselves and with their customers. So like that's very similar to what we went through. Like we were using Module Federation, we felt the pain, all of our customers felt the pain from the consulting side, and we're like, we need to make this stop, and then we started to build Zephyr.
This is so cool. You know, this is such a common path, and I want to pause and acknowledge this for listeners, especially since this is like CEO season. This is such a recurring theme. So many people started this way. For example, Jeff Cross from NX. Same thing. They were working with monorepos, also in the enterprise space, and every enterprise was struggling with monorepo after monorepo, and they said, you know what? NX, we're making a product, we're going to fix it. And to this day, everything new that comes to NX comes out of their consulting work, where they sort of recognize, this can be abstracted. And now that's literally how NX grows and develops. And I think that's so cool.
Well, I think a lot of it also comes from the community too, right? Because like the RSPack stuff that we added to NX. Victor Savkin, who's one of the other co-founder of NX, together with a bunch of their team, saw what we were doing, and then we did it as a community plugin. Now it started to make its way into the core product, right? So a lot of it comes from consulting, but also a lot of it comes from community driven, which is interesting because the same thing's happening with Module Federation. Like the community was saying we need these hooks, and the community was saying we need these tools, and we went and built the tools and built the products around it.
That is so cool. And so for those listening, if you want to start a company, maybe consult, find problems that are reproducible, and then solve them through a product. There's also, we had the founder and CEO of Geeky Ants, a very large, this is probably one of the biggest consultancies that I've had on the podcast, 500 employees. They've got like 2 buildings and a London office. And they also started consulting, mostly with React Native. And now have recognized a need, and so they're moving towards products. They're building a product called GlueStack, which is React. It's basically a component library, but that is universal. Works on native, works on web with server components. It's just beautiful. Yeah, and it's just their clients keep having these problems. I think that is so cool. Okay, so Zephyr Cloud started to fix the pain of enterprises with specifically module federation. How does it do that? So let's assume that. Oh, wait, I see you. I see the wheels turning in your head. What did you do?
Well, so like I'll kind of go through the generations of problems that we started to solve, right?
Awesome.
Because the first thing that we ran into is, okay, great, we have all these federated remotes. Production just went down. Whose fault is it? Right? Because what would happen is people would deploy something and they'd be in a completely different time zone, and while you were asleep and they got deployed, you come in the next day and production's down and you have no idea what happened, right? So one of the first things that we needed to do was to provide observability into when versions are changing, right? Because if you think about it, if your remote in your module federation config is just a string that gets you to an S3 bucket and someone updated the files on those S3 bucket, not very much telemetry around that, right? So customers were going down, and that was the thing. So we added the observability around that, and then they said, okay, great, I have this, .com with 50 micro front ends, and those 50 micro front ends all depend on things, and I could be n levels deep. I have no way to visualize that without opening a bunch of GitHub repos and having to dig through it myself and look at a bunch of Webpack configs, right? That's not fun. Nobody wants to do that. So then we built the node graphs around your micro front ends, which is very cool. You have some similar tools for Kubernetes and backend, right? Then people were like, okay, great. How do we deploy this properly on the cloud or to the edge, right? Because everyone's talking about the edge. Let's talk about the edge. So how do I deploy this properly to the edge? So then we figured out how to deploy to the edge, and that was when we really had a switch flip for ourselves, because then we realized we could develop with the edge. And what's really interesting about that is if you think about your application as micro front ends or federated remotes, you are frequently developing one of those remotes. So let's say you're working on the header. Why should you have to spin up the entire application, the entire backend, just to be able to work on the header? Instead, you should be able to just go to staging or any environment of your choice, open a Chrome extension, and swap the header to the one that you're building. Now it has not impacted a single user. The only one that sees it is you, and your live reload, your HMR, is what you're working on with staging. And because it's all living on the same edge, when it comes time to deploy it to production, this is where it works with small teams and big teams, is you just hit publish. And that snapshot is now live. It didn't work? Great. Hit a drop down and hit publish again, and you're back to the previous version. And all it is a snapshot that's pointing to a combination of remotes. So now there is no deployment, right? So we did a tweet a while back that showed like, here's how it works on Netlify versus how it works with Zephyr. And it wasn't a dig on Netlify. It was showing like traditionally, even with Vercel, you commit, their GitHub action picks it up, it builds it, it deploys it. And the fastest I've seen that is 10, 15 seconds, right? That's after you've built it and tested it locally. With Zephyr, the deployment to the edge is a side effect of your local build. Very similar to like NX caching, right? But instead of caching the build so that other builds can happen, it is done. It is live on the edge and available for you to consume anywhere you want. So now your local development, if you're like, hey, check out what I'm working on, you give them your link and they can see it. There's no ngrok or an ngrok. Sorry, I'm an Angular guy. I say ngrok. There's no ngrok anymore. If your laptop shuts off, it's still there. So my CTO is in Prague. He could be working on something locally, and I can see it live reloading on my Mac or on my phone or wherever I am, and be able to see that. So like that shift in mindset applies to both federated applications and a startup person who's working on their first demo site, right? That iteration speed, that speed on the edge, like you're in a pitch meeting and you got to do something quick. How much faster is it than when you hit save that 400 milliseconds later is live on the edge?
Can we talk about can we talk about how that works? You're like blowing my mind
I
here.
just blew your mind. I'm sorry.
Is this proprietary, or can we talk about how its internals work? Because if you mentioned you open a secure tunnel from my local host without ngrok.
No, there is no secure tunnel. It's deployed
then
to the edge.
What do you mean? So when I hit save, it deploys my Micro-Frontend to the edge? Oh, is that through some VS Code extension, or how? Like there needs to be a save event, right? Like a git push or something.
No, it's part of the build lifecycle. So Zephyr hooks into the build itself, and as the build completes, it publishes just the diff of the assets. So it does it. So once you do your first build, you're starting to see it's fun. Once you do your first build, and that takes whatever your build time is, it'll upload the entire application, which for most applications is under a second, so it is what it is. And the default cloud provider we have is Cloudflare. So after your build, less than a second later, it's live on Cloudflare Edge. If you've ever tried to set up Cloudflare Edge by yourself with a GitHub action, it's not always the easiest thing to do, especially for new developers. That's why companies like Vercel and Netlify exist, because they, easy, deployment to the edge, it's scalable, blah, 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 right? With Zephyr, you add one line of code to your application, and then the next build you do is deployed to the edge.
Okay. I have so many questions about this. So I kind of do understand. You hook, so it seems like there's instead of like running npx vite or npx webpack dev server, I would run a Zephyr command for my local host, for my local dev.
You still run your exact same build command.
Okay. You said it's hooked into the build process such that when I hit save.
So when the Webpack, let's say you're using Webpack or RSPack, right? Sure. You add a line to your RSPack config that says with Zephyr.
That's what I was missing.
When you go do a build, after the build seals, then it'll publish it to Cloudflare.
Right, and with a dev server, every time you hit save, it does a build.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
You wouldn't necessarily even use dev server anymore. You would just do build watch.
Okay.
And because you don't need a server running locally, because you're running against the edge, right? And there's a lot of really fun implications for that. So your backend is still there because it's on the edge. Your other teams are still there. And what the demo we're actually planning for one of the conferences coming up is you can actually have live reload on multiple remotes, and you could have 3 developers or multiple developers coding at once and see a single page live reloading with other people's updates. And it sounds really noisy and annoying as all get out, but like it demos really well. The nice part about that though is, let's say you and someone else are working on, I'm doing the header, you're doing the body, we're trying to make sure checkout works in between the two, right? You can both be working together in real time and pair programming on completely separate code bases, on completely separate remotes, and see them stitched together on the edge, and all be using the same backend.
You talk about the edge though, but what if this pair programming is happening, but like it's different edges? Meaning I'm at the Frankfurt edge and my friend is at the US East edge. Given that,
like just Cloudflare, it's fine
because Cloudflare propagates very quickly to all points of presence. Wow.
But also we're adding support for AWS and GCP and Azure and ByteDance and Vercel and Netlify. So pretty much all of the cloud providers are already in play, just at various stages of implementation. I believe Netlify should be coming in the next week or two. AWS is very close as well. And we have some folks at ByteDance that are helping us build on top
That
of
is so
ByteDance.
cool. You mentioned a browser extension. I think it would be so cool in case this doesn't exist. What I would love. So thank you, by the way. This
Yeah.
My mind was blown, but now my mind comprehends, and I think it's so cool that I don't need localhost anymore. I just build in quote unquote production. It's staging,
Imagine
but
doing it with Towery.
stage. What was that?
Imagine when you're doing it with Towery.
For native applications. Oh my goodness,
Because
that's
Towery
incredible.
uses a bundler underneath, right? And you
Right.
can use RSPack with Towery. Sorry, go
Wow.
ahead.
Wow. No, that this is so cool, and I'm starting to see it now. So okay, I don't need a local dev server. I just pull up staging, use my browser extension, and hit save, and things go live. And I can share this link with anybody because it is actually deployed to the edge. It's not a local machine. That's incredible. Can I wonder if there's a way to, using a browser extension, probably in a staging environment, embed like little drop downs into each federated remote, such that I can choose which remote I want to see in here. Oh
That's in
my
our Chrome
goodness!
extension. So you can step back and forward on any remote, and so it lists all the remotes on that page, and you can step through them. And what's interesting is the way Zephyr works is it follows NPM standards. So all of the remotes have the concepts of tags and versions. So you can follow and say, okay, I want the header at this tag, or I want the header at this version. But what's interesting is, when you fork something, you can have your own tag. So I want to see Dima's tag of the header at this version. I can. I want to see head of where Dima's at, right? So like you can watch while Dima's coding, and you can see the remotes just live reloading as he's going through his development process, right? And that's because it follows tags and versioning. And where that comes into play is that you set up rules in Zephyr that says, okay, if there's a build on main branch that happens, then it updates the version for this tag, right? So that way, that's how you kind of control things in production, because it sounds really dangerous. Like everyone's building and deploying to the edge at once, like production's going to be a mess. Well, no, because everything in production is following the production tags or the stable tags, and those stable tags versions only get updated when a build happens in like Jenkins or GitHub or whatever it is, right? But what's nice about that is that if something does go wrong, you just either go to the Zephyr UI or the Zephyr side panel, go to the production release, hit one drop down, bump that one offending remote back to a version, hit publish in sub-second, it's live on the edge again. So the deployments and rollbacks are now almost instantaneous.
Wow. What potential for skew is there here? For example, if I have a micro-frontend that is maybe ahead or dependent on a backend version that is not yet deployed, is there skew protection? I imagine this will eventually become an issue.
Yeah, it's something we're adding. It's on our roadmap, and we're doing it both on dependencies, right? Because there is some breaking change. Let's say different versions of Apollo, different versions of React, because there's stuff on React 18 that you would be able to do if you're using 16. So the skew protection is coming, and we're going to do that around your versions of your remotes as well. So you'll be able to say, okay, I need this different version of the remote. I can't load this yet. So we are adding that. We're also adding it on backend as well. The thing we don't talk about very much, but is also something that we're testing and using locally, is using Zephyr and Module Federation for the backend. So Node APIs.
I mean, why not? Yeah.
Right. So now imagine you have 50 microservices that are all based on Node that use Module Federation, and you have a new version of identity that comes out because you found a critical bug. Do you take your millions of viewers and say, okay, great, we need to cycle all of our APIs and have various APIs in various stages? Or do you go to Zephyr, bump the version of identity, and all of them HMR it? Which would you rather do?
Yeah, and wait, when you say HMR, you mean HMR in production? So like a user using
on the server.
What? Incredible.
So that, like, you can see like that becomes really fun, right? So now you can HMR things on the server, you can HMR things on the client, you can have these independently versioned modules. You can do that with Towery, you can do that with React Native. Like, there's a lot of really fun stuff that you can do. But where it gets interesting to me is that now the feature flag conversation we were having, right? Why would you use feature flags when deployments are sub-second? Why would you don't need feature flags for, quote unquote security, because you're testing your local development against staging or production, right? There's less likelihood of you making those mistakes in the first place when you have real data, real scale, real backend versus the small subset of data that you usually have on your local machine.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. You mentioned Tower, you mentioned React Native. What I'm not seeing, because, and maybe this is just me being familiar with module federation in the JavaScript ecosystem, but React Native and Towery both have Rust or iOS or Kotlin components to them, especially React Native. React Native, indeed, is driven by a JavaScript bundle, but also binds to native APIs, vibration, battery, accelerometer. How would that work with module federation? I'm not seeing the...
with Repack?
No.
So Repack, I'll drop the link to that.
Thank you.
So Repack is a toolkit for building, just stealing it from their website, a toolkit for building your React Native application with Webpack.
Okay.
They are, I believe they've already moved to RSPack. If not, they're in the process of doing it right now. If you remember our conversation about RSPack, it already supports module federation. So building React Native applications with module federation. So with module federation support. So that means we can begin to do things with Zephyr and module federation in React Native, because all this is just changing what bundles are being loaded, right? And Towery is the same thing. So I was talking with the Towery core team about this, and they want the ability to be able to lazy load remotes inside of Towery. They already, the vast majority of Towery is using, Rust, right? That's the whole purpose of Towery Secure. It's all that stuff, right? But they still have web front ends that you can use inside of Towery that are built with standard bundlers, whether it's RSPack or Webpack, right? Or Vite, or whatever your bundler choice. I have nothing against Vite. So if you're using RSPack to bundle your front end inside of a Towery application, you can have federated remotes, right? And those federated remotes can be coming from Zephyr, can be coming from, and inside your Towery application. So that becomes really interesting. And there's some things that we're going to look at doing around signing the remotes, especially in like a Towery ecosystem where everything's supposed to be super secure. If we can work, we're going to be working, especially because of fintechs too, on how do you properly sign a remote to be consumed. There's some very interesting stuff around that, but it is possible. It is something that we're working on, and you should be able to see it in the relative near future.
Fantastic. What gatekeeping exists around promoting remotes to certain tags or labels like stable or production? In GitHub, for example, you have pull requests, right? You have to approve a pull request before it makes it to main. Is there a similar construct with Zephyr Cloud for promoting, a staging remote to production?
So we have the ability to add rules. So you could say only these people have the ability to do things. So there's that. But the nice thing about it is you could attach it to your existing CI/CD pipeline, right? If your rules require you to merge something to main before it becomes production, then just set Zephyr to say, okay, we're not going to bump the version until it builds on main, right? And, to pull on that NX thread a little bit, right? If you're using affected graphs and you're deciding, when you're building different remotes based off of the affected graph in your monorepo, right? That will only bump those versions when it's built on main, and you'll have a series of remotes that will bump at the same time. and be able to see that reflected inside of Zephyr and reflected inside of your CI/CD pipeline. But we don't like to force people to use other tools than they're familiar with. So a lot of our stuff is based off of NPM semantics or GitHub or any existing CI/CD pipeline.
Awesome. This everything you say makes it seem more compelling. Finally, I wanted to ask you about the observability problems that you started to solve, because you mentioned if a remote's on an S3 bucket and the S3 bucket's unavailable, you're just like, oops. If I was to like sort of speculate a little bit about how you'd go about solving this, I assume you'd own the S3 bucket and then repeatedly monitor it by pinging it, so you know when it goes down and you can report that to the user. I'm not sure. My question is here: how is that fixed at a technical level?
So there's an interesting thing. So Zephyr functions on a bring your own cloud model for the most part.
Okay.
If you're not using our default built-in cloud, we encourage you to bring your own cloud, your own AWS account, your own Cloudflare account. So we don't manage that part. But if let's say Amazon did go down, right, which has happened, right? S3 buckets have disappeared. In Zephyr, let's say you went and created a new account on Azure, for example, as a HA. High availability HA. So let's say you went and bought another cloud. No, you already had another cloud because you're in the process of migrating. You would go into Zephyr and you would hit one button to switch what your default cloud provider is for that remote, and you would hit deploy, and it would deploy that remote to the new cloud, and you would be done. So we don't have to force a bunch of configuration. We don't have to do a bunch of noise because all of that's handled internally inside of Zephyr. And you could redeploy your entire front end to an entire new cloud with just by doing a build, right? Which is really cool. The observability part comes more on the understanding how the remotes are changing over time. So as we integrate Sentry data, as we integrate RUM data, you will be able to see how the remotes that you're consuming are impacting your performance. These people started using SSR, and once they started doing that, then our TTFB went down, or our time to first byte, or whatever impacts it had. They imported a new library. Here's the library they imported. Here's the 700 KB they just added to the bundle. Yes, it's lazy loaded. Yes, it's federated, but it's still impacting different things on the site. You will be able to see that across versions with our observability, which is pretty cool when you think about you have large distributed teams that, like Spotify, right? Someone changes the image compression of the cover art and there could be an issue, but you have no idea when it happened, how it happened, but users are reporting that the app is suddenly slow. With Zephyr, you'd be able to see that.
And if your some remote is down, you'd also just see that like X number of requests to this have failed, and so and you can see when they failed, and so get an idea of the impact radius, so to speak, and the time domain, and you can use that for postmortems. Is there failover in this case?
Yeah, so
like automatic?
There is failover. We haven't added it to be automatic, but that is available in Module Federation itself. So you can have, and we encourage people to do this. You can have fallbacks to different versions of the remote. So if my remote is not available in the CDN, fall back to the local version, which is really good for like Tower and React Native as well. So like, hey, if I'm somewhere that doesn't have signal and I can't access the remotes, fall back to the bundled version, right? And you could do the same thing with Module Federation, with or without Zephyr. We're going to add more native capabilities to that inside of Zephyr, because one of the things that we do is we get rid of all of the configuration you have to do. So instead of having that hundreds of lines of configuration that says like, I depend on the header and here's what I consume from the header, and here's those singletons and all that stuff, with Zephyr you just say I depend on header, and then we resolve all the URLs, everything else for you. and where it will get really interesting is like on the edge when we start to do our what we call reverse tree shaking, which is where we will go and look at the snapshot and be able to shake out additional code based on our understanding of the application that you didn't have at build time. So there'll be some fun stuff that comes with that, but that's a whole different conversation.
Incredible. How long has this been in development? Because I just heard about it recently.
August?
When did it start? What, August of 2023?
Yes.
So less than a year.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I will admit I haven't yet had the chance to give it a try, but I feel motivated to. However, I don't have a big team that could benefit from it.
Just build your podcast homepage on it, and then it's like I tell people, like, if you're just building like a simple website, if you've ever used Dreamweaver, right? Do you remember back when Dreamweaver was a really big thing, and you could hit that little socket button in the corner, and it would live upload everything to your PHP server that you had that was running your site? Zephyr is a very similar feeling. It's instant gratification because once you build, it's live, and being able to get to that point is really fun because you can't go back. Like, we had one team tell us that if they tried to take Zephyr away, we would quit.
Wow!
Because everything is instant now. Why would you want to go back to it not being instant?
So my website, I'm just hypothetically, if I decide to take it to Zephyr, I use Astro for it. Does Zephyr work with frameworks? I mean, these frameworks probably have module federation compatibility. So in my mind, at least, it's not that far of a cry for Zephyr to just natively support them, including serverless function execution and all of the goodies that come with a framework. So I guess the question is, can I just take my Astro site and port it to Zephyr with minimal effort?
We have not tested Astro, but we do have Quick. Which so Quick is a fun one. We have Quick, Angular, React, and Vue already. I'm assuming Astro is something we could get to if there was enough demand for it or someone wanted to contribute it. But if it's using Vite, then it may possibly work on it already. Cool. So because our limitations are more on the bundler than on the framework itself, and if the framework is doing a bunch of tweaks for the bundler, like Quick had a bunch of custom stuff on top of Vite that we had to go and build a custom adapter for. But once we did that, we were able to understand how Quick is outputting during its build and be able to do everything we need to do.
Did you mention somebody could contribute it? What percentage of Zephyr Cloud's product is open source? I mean, obviously, Module Federation is open source.
Yep.
But
Module Federation itself is open source. We're going to be open sourcing more stuff as we go live, because we're in the process of onboarding all the different public clouds, and most likely those integrations will be public as well. Because people want to see what we're putting on their Cloudflare workers, but we'll see how that goes because there's some interesting things around VC funding and stuff like that. We want to make sure that we don't mess up. So there's some conversations around that we're going to have, but we do want to open source more, and everything that we did on the consulting side, we tried to push towards open source. So like that's how Valor Software started. That's how I got started, is through open source. So it's very important to our core.
Incredible. As we start to wrap up, by the way, I've learned so much. This episode is reminiscent of an episode we did with Rizelle Scarlett from TBD. She works on Web 5, and she came on the podcast, and I'm just like, what is Web 5? Is it like Web 3? Is it like a big scam? And she did such an excellent job, like you, of explaining to me its rationale. It turns out Web 5 is the best parts of Web 3 plus the best parts of Web 2. 2 plus 3, 5. Cool.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and she really.
What happened to 4?
I asked the same question in my podcast, and she did such a good job of like patiently explaining these things to me and really converting me from being a skeptic to one who sees the value in a web where its users own their property. And so this episode sort of just gives me flashbacks to that, because I was not a user of Module Federation or Micro-Frontend architecture, because mainly I've worked in teams that were not that big. Even at Spotify, I worked in like a 8-person team who was working on like one specific thing. We were not working on like the web player or checkout, for example. And so I didn't have much experience with it. And what I have heard at conferences was people hating on it, and on Twitter, people just absolutely saying, you don't need it. It's whatever. And so your ability to come here and like not only patiently explain its primitives, but also go through the steps of, okay, this is the problems with an iframe, and this is a problem with lazy. It was so good. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to shift focus and ask you perhaps one of the final questions, if not the final question, which is, we're in the middle of CEO and founder/co-founder series. And I've been asking this of everybody, and the context here, and this is somewhat of a long question. I apologize, but it's more to give you context so you can think of a thoughtful answer. We were sitting together with some founders and CEOs last year, and the sentiment in the room was nobody prepares you for this, especially if you're not a professional CEO that like shareholders and board members like headhunt, so to speak, and elect to be the CEO. If you're a technical open source background founder and the CEO, a technical CEO, you're unprepared, and you've got to adapt, and things change. And we said earlier this year, or maybe last year, I forget, we said, wouldn't it be cool if there was like a charter for the first time, or the early technical CEO as opposed to the professional CEO? Wouldn't it be cool if like HTML and JavaScript are living standards? There's big specification documents, right? Wouldn't it be cool if there was such a document for technical founders and CEOs? And the document, obviously, everyone's experience is unique and different. So that adds some challenge there. But I wonder, as the podcast is in the middle of the season, if we naturally have the basis for like extrapolating some common salient features of these and putting them in some type of document like that. So the question, finally, I apologize, a little long. In the case such a document like this was to exist, the technical founder charter, the early non-professional CEO document, living standard. From your experience building Zephyr Cloud, what would you add to that as a clause for other technical founders and CEOs?
That's an interesting one, because I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the amount of wrong advice that I was given as we were founding this, even around like how to pitch VCs, right?
Wow.
Every single person, every single VC even has their own opinion. Every single startup founder has their own opinion. And half of it is going to be wrong, half of it's going to be right. And the reality is you have to start to figure out what you want your identity is, what you want your identity as a company, and what's important to you. Because there will be people who will say the best way to grow a startup is you have to work 1 million hours, you have to sacrifice your family, you need to move to SF, you need to do all of those things, right? And there'll be the exact opposite that is more of like a lifestyle founder, right? You only need to work 2 to 3 hours a day, you can go hang out on the beach and all that kind of stuff, right? And you have to figure out as a founder what your core values are and align them to yourself and what you want your organization to be. And so obviously, yes, take input as feedback and thoughts, but you don't have to stress of like, oh, I'm not DHH, I'm not Elon Musk, I'm not, I'm doing these things wrong, I'm not sleeping on a cot in the middle of the office. Like, that doesn't make you a startup founder, right? The whole YC, you have to move, you have to live on a rented, mattress, whatever that lifestyle. That works for some people. For me, it doesn't, right? I have a family and 4 kids, and I'm still going to go to football games. I'm still going to go to the gymnastics meets. And does that change when I work? Yes, I work before and after they sleep, right? But if you listen to some founders, they'll say, well, you can't do that, right? You need to be working 24/7, basically. I'm not. I'm in New York with my family, celebrate my anniversary, right? That's important to me. But at the same time, I made some time to do this podcast, and I made time for some other meetings later today. And we found a balance that works for our family. And I think that's something that's important to realize as a founder, that nobody is you. Nobody's your company. And you need to figure out what it is that you're trying to do.
And the measure of the other advice I've been given is wrong is the value you see from doing it the way that's true to your values, right? So for example, you say, I reject this advice, I'm going to do it my way, and then that brings results that move the needle in the direction you want them to move, and you go, oh, look, I'm not following the DHH way or the Elon Musk way, and it's quote unquote working. I'm meeting my goals.
There's a really good quote by Earl Nightingale. Really, really old quote. And it says that success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. And if you can internalize that, it makes it a lot easier to go through the noise.
Totally. It also sort of reinforces this idea from James Clear about atomic habits, because it speaks to almost like a JPEG loading with progressive network parameters on, right? Like you get the blurry thing, and that's sort of the mental image I have based on that quote.
Yep.
Well, listen, Zachary, on that note, or Zach, you're not in trouble. I'd love to.
Zachary,
I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to leave it here, but I would be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge the enormous contribution you've made to the listeners, to me, but also to the tech ecosystem, right? Sort of like challenging this idea of you need local host and going like, no, we just deploy instantaneously to the edge, right, and you can iterate in real time. I think that is so cool. I am so excited for Zephyr Cloud and actually to try out Module Federation as well on my website. Why not? And so on behalf of myself and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all of these things with us.
Thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Zachary Chapple. I hope, like me, you now understand Micro-Frontends, Module Federation in a little bit more detail and also understand the nuance around them. That is why we do this podcast, right? Like in an age of like fast food style content, Module Federation sucks, HTMX is bad or good or like whatever. We want to give you the nuance, and I hope you got some of that today. I hope you understand the terminology, the times to use them, and also appreciate the work going into Zephyr Cloud to help developers ship safe and fast. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you to, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel and maybe leave a like. That does help more than you know, and it costs you nothing to do so. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, if you could leave us up to a 5-star review, that would be super helpful. And then if you want to share the episode too, I won't say no. All of this helps get some signal from noise and understand, whether this is useful or not. And if it's not useful, then probably best doing something else with my time. Thank you for joining. Thank you to the sponsors, and most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.